Hi, and welcome to the Scrum.org podcast series, actually in person today. We're at Gillette, downtown Boston, and we're going to have an opportunity to talk a little bit about the new Scrum Razor and how professional Scrum is being used outside of the software industry. And I'm very fortunate to have David here, David Ingram. Welcome. Senior Vice President R&D.
Vice President R&D, yes.
Oh, so I gave you a promotion.
Yeah,
then. Maybe,
you did.
Maybe they're listening and they'll follow that lead. Well, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
In person and not just obviously in voice. So thanks for taking the time.
And welcome to the World Shaving Headquarters.
I know, it's kind of exciting because when you are from Boston, you go past this area and there's like smoke and steam coming from it. And it's really exciting to actually come in here and see where actually the first reusable razor or disposable razor was ever created 120 years ago, right?
That's right, King C. Gillette started it all here.
I know, which is a bit of history for our listeners, a little bit of history today. Okay, so we're going to be talking about Scrum and how professional Scrum was used to develop the latest razor from Gillette, which is really exciting. But before we go into the sort of details of how you're using Scrum, can you give us a little bit of the backstory? Why did you decide to do it? What was the context so that we can get everybody up to speed on it?
Yeah, no, for sure, Dave. Really, if you look at Gillette as a company, and you mentioned we've been here for 120 years, started in South Boston with King C. Gillette. Really, we've been providing people that shave with outstanding products for 120 years. And when they want to get the best shave they can get, they buy our products. And as we've invested in understanding people who shave and in developing products that can improve that experience, we've brought out, a series of different products that people will know and identify with, that they say, yeah, that gives me my best shave. And, we've had Gillette Sensor, we've had, the Mark III, we've had Fusion, we've had Pro Glide and Pro Shield, and each product has got successively better. So we're a company with a great history of providing great products that delight consumers, but we were here in 2019 and we hadn't yet developed our next product. What would our next great product be? We knew that we needed to come and develop something. We hadn't come out with a new razor for a long time, or for a reasonable time, and we wanted to develop something new. At the same time, things had changed in the world around. You were commenting earlier on my beard. We used to have a world where certainly men got up in the morning and went to the office and they all shaved. Now we don't have a situation where that's true anymore. So what we needed to do was come out with a product that was relevant to people and really started to raise shaving and change it from a kind of everyday chore or an infrequent chore into an everyday delight. So we had these challenges that we needed to do to come out with our best ever product in a world that was very different. And we were quite honestly given a challenge from our CEO of grooming to do it faster than we'd ever done it before. We were given a very clear target for a launch time, and putting that all together raised a very big challenge for us in terms of developing a new product.
But you've been developing products for 120 years. Why did you decide to do Scrum? What was, is it this, how fast, how complex, the number of people involved? What was the sort of like the catalyst to using Scrum?
Yeah, it really was bringing those three elements together of the challenge that we had to develop, which was, develop a better razor. We hold our bar very high on our new products. They have to be delightful for the consumer. So keep that bar very high. Different world environment. Consumer needs and tastes have changed in terms of what they're looking for, but also this big timing challenge that we were given. And we knew that, to develop something in a couple of years, where our traditional waterfall process would tell us that it would take 5 years or so, said, wow, we've got to do something different here. We know if we develop this with waterfall, how long it's going to take. And we know that doesn't fit the time that we have. So we're going to have to do something different. And that led us really on to, okay, what's the different way of doing this? What's out there as something we can look for and adopt?
That's super exciting. So time frame, changing customer needs, and obviously this sort of very high quality bar that Gillette always has. Just I'd like to an embarrassing admission maybe to our listeners. I actually used the razor today, so hopefully you can see how sharp my cleanness is today. It's pretty impressive. So all right, so you decide to look for something else. You didn't start with Scrum though, right? You knew you had to work in a different way. So how did you actually get to Scrum?
Yeah, well, Procter & Gamble is a big company. Gillette's part of Procter & Gamble, and it wouldn't surprise you to know that we've got different experiments happening all over the company with different ways to work. So the first thing that we did was ask other people in the company, find out who's doing what in different places. And we found a number of different kind of tools that are out there. Some were very good for accelerating execution, and some others like Scrum were better at design phase acceleration, where really the uncertainty and the complexity are high. And as we looked at the challenge that we had, we really figured out that we didn't have an execution speed challenge. What we had was a design phase challenge. How would we get the design from not having anything to being locked in the time frame that we had? And that's where, as we asked around inside the company, it was clear that a Scrum methodology was going to be our best bet to kind of address that design phase speed challenge.
That's interesting, because most people think of Scrum really in software as just that execution thing. You break your work down, you work in sprints, you deliver into production continuously and the like. But actually what you were using it for was to really understand the problem, understand the solution, understand the design, work with all those different groups and bring an increment together that was ultimately the product frequently so that your stakeholders could look at it. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the difference with software, Dave. If you look at a software company can release their product continuously. I know they almost do now. For us, still as in a hardware company, there comes a point where you have to spend your capital and buy your molds and your equipment.
Yeah.
Really, that's our launch date. It's very difficult to change things after that. So it's that period leading up to that lock date where we have all of the uncertainty. And once you've bought pieces of equipment, pieces of steel, you can't iterate very much and change after that. So really, we front load our iterative process to that point where we say, yeah, we've got a locked product here that's good enough for us to go and invest in, buy the capital that we need to get ready to go and start producing this and launch.
So really the whole focus of the use of Scrum was to mitigate those risks earlier in that, so sort of like push left those risks to raise those risks in front of all the right stakeholders, all of the right team members, so you could mitigate them so that when you got to that launch date, you were going to, be able to launch the razor and everything was going to be fine.
It's a great point. It's very easy to say, let's just start spending money earlier. The problem with that is, as you say, you don't know the risks that you're sitting on, and you discover them later and you find out that you spent money on something that isn't what you need.
Yeah.
And so exactly, how do we get a process that we start to understand the uncertainty and the risks and get all of those out of the way with a great proposition at the time when we need to lock it and start spending the money?
So I'd really like to drill into that a little bit, because I think that's really interesting. Gillette's part of a P&G, one of the largest consumer packaged goods companies in the world, if not the largest. So I can't imagine there's a culture that likes to find problems out as a rule. It's kind of a very risk-averse organization. That's the nature of large organizations, right? Incredibly successful, therefore risk-averse. How do you change the culture so that you actually do encourage people to find issues? Was that a problem when you started using Scrum?
No, I wouldn't say that in P&G the culture is risk averse, quite honestly, but I would say what we have in the waterfall process is a set of procedures to go and sequentially assess risk. But that tends to be done in quite a functional setup. So you look sequentially at different parts of your proposition, and you kind of figure out where the risks are according to your usual work process. So that's a good way of assuming risk at the start of a project and then figuring out where the risk is. The problem with that approach is that if you find out very late, if you have this sequential work process and the big risk is in something that you discover late on, you have to redo all of the work you did up to that point. The big difference with Scrum is effectively you take that sequential work process and start doing everything in parallel, focusing on what you believe are your biggest risks to start with, regardless of when you would usually work them. And that means that you can then get those big ones out the way early, rather than discover them after 18 months of working sequentially through the risks. So it's not so much risk aversion, but how do you decide which risks to go and tackle when? And how do you start to understand them? That was the real shift.
So did that require you to make some changes to the way in which, some very senior stakeholders engaged with the team? They come to the meetings expecting to see these documents in a nice sequential waterfall process because they've done it many times before. And you were suddenly saying, well, here's actually a sample of the actual product. This is the marketing plan. This is, we've worked with the channel, I assume. These are their biggest issues, that they're going to deal with. This is regional pricing, all of this at the same time. Did that require some retraining of the stakeholders?
It did. It led us to have to look at things in a different way. As you said, the waterfall process that you would usually do, you have check-ins with stakeholders at certain milestones, which might be 6 or 9 months apart. Which is fine when you're in a reasonably known environment, but when you have a large number of unknowns across these different aspects of the proposition, you need the stakeholders to engage. But critically, what's different is you need your set of stakeholders ready to engage in the actual issues that you have, not their perceived functional issues that they might care about. So what was really one of the critical changes for us in how we set the project up was to make sure that there were a very few objectives for the project that were really based on our consumers and our business outcomes, rather than any functional goals whatsoever. And then as we set up, instead of these milestone reviews that were months apart, we had our regular stakeholder reviews after every sprint. We could bring to them the risks that we were finding that were attached to the overall project objectives and ask them to work with us through those, rather than look at things through a functional lens and the normal level of readiness of a functional lens there. So it did require a very different way of talking about the risks and about raising those to stakeholders and getting our stakeholders comfortable with what we were choosing to talk at any particular point in time.
Wow, that is a fundamental paradigm shift, isn't it? Because ultimately, you broke the project, instead of breaking it down into all these functional objectives, which all then got into this incredibly complicated plan, which is the traditional waterfall model. What you did was you focused on your very small set of real business objectives. You then said, okay, considering these, how do we break down the work to ensure we're making progress against those? And then let's leave your functional hat. I mean, obviously that's where everybody comes from, but leave that particular bias, come and look, this is what we're focused on this sprint. This is what we're focused on this sprint. That must have been very interesting and kind of enjoyable. I mean,
I think everyone enjoyed it because we knew we were working on the thing that was relevant for the overall team right then. So I think people enjoyed knowing that we were talking about something that was relevant and critical. It didn't always make for comfortable conversations, of course. Sometimes you hope things are going to be one way and you get data that you find they're not that way. But at least it meant that we had those conversations early. And we managed to work out the tension and figure out the route forward from the earliest stage we could.
So how many people were working on this program?
Yeah, so that was the other really interesting bit, is you open your Scrum guide and it says, okay, a Scrum team should be, 7 to 10 people maximum, and we look at, to do a project like a product like our exfoliating razor, we first of all, how many people do we have? We didn't know, you don't count normally how many people you have really on the project. So who's working on this? And we ended up with about 55 people. Now, versus a standard Scrum team size of 7 or 10, 55 doesn't work very well. So actually, the first advice we got within the company, which was great advice, was to go and find a certified Agile coach to go and help us figure out how to go and run a Scrum project. Within the company, the advice was very clear: don't try and do this on your own. Go and find somebody that knows what they're talking about, which we did, and we were very lucky to find a coach from Agile Sparks that could help us. And really, they helped us figure out, so Yuval Yeret helped us figure out, okay, look, these 55 people, how can we split them into logical teams that make sense in terms of ownership for a part of this proposition, but can also then work in parallel together on the whole. So if you think about, us making a razor, we have the razor itself, we have a stand for the razor, we have packaging for the razor, we have how we're going to manufacture the razor, we have the marketing for the razor. So you can start to split up these different teams into different targets that they have, which can still be attached to the overall objectives for the project.
Yeah.
But which are really working in parallel on what are their biggest risks then in making that part of the proposition. And so we broke up the team into, I think, 7 or 8 teams that were working in parallel. And of course, towards the overall product backlog, the question then, of course, was how do you coordinate the teams and how do you get that done?
And how did you? Did you have one integrated increment across all the teams? Did you have one ultimate product backlog? Are they some of the things that you used?
We did, absolutely. We had, we ran sprints in a unified increment. So all sprints for all teams started and ended at the same time. And we had one sprint review across the teams, which was great. And then what we did was we had one backlog. So obviously the individual product teams could define what they would work in terms of items against that overall backlog, but we very closely maintained that overall backlog for the project.
That's awesome. So you got that transparency across team so that you or any stakeholder or any team member could look and see what everybody was doing. And then when things popped up, you're like, well, hang on a minute, we're doing something similar. You could deal with those issues straight away. What about things like daily scrums? Did you have one?
We found some, we left it up to the teams, quite honestly. So some teams had a daily stand-up. Some teams did it every other day. Some teams did it, once a week. We left it to the teams to define what they wanted to do, and most of them found a pattern, or all of them found a pattern that worked for them. What we did mandate that we would do is we had a once weekly integration meeting. Yeah. So we asked the product owners and Scrum Masters from each of those individual teams to come to a weekly integration meeting, which we closely maintained, so that we knew we were getting that coordination across teams during the sprint as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot. That makes a lot of sense. So we're running Scrum. We've got multiple teams working towards these increments. Product ownership, that's always something that everybody asks, particularly in organizations aren't necessarily, because they're functionally aligned, not outcome aligned. So as a rule, who was the product owner? Did you have several? How did that work?
What we figured out would work for us is we actually had a small team of overall product owners for the overall project. So we had my counterpart, the vice president in marketing, myself from a research and development point of view, and then we had a consumer expert and somebody from our manufacturing organization. And we then made sure that we were acting in unison as a product owner team. Then for each one of the individual development teams, we had an individual product owner for each one of those teams. And then we made sure that the product owners of the individual teams and their backlogs were aligned with the overall product owner team and the backlog that we aligned there.
Okay, so that meant a lot of communication between those people. Cool. Do you think that was the best way, or do you think you could have perhaps had a few less product owner types? What do you think?
I think for us it worked well. In theory, we could do with less types. You remember as well that we're coming here from an environment where we organize things in our functions.
Yeah.
And everyone kind of is responsible for their bit. Of course, we work together very closely, but it's very different then to say, we'll look overall at the objectives for the project and we'll manage those together. And remember that when you've been working in your functional silos, you don't have expertise for the other functions work. This is a skill that we haven't developed. We've got no history for this. So I think for us, as we look at, how do we get into Scrum, we needed in that PO team the functional expertise to even be able to understand the backlog and how do we put things together, or how do we articulate what needs to be done to the development teams. So it was helpful for us in this first scaled Scrum experiment to have that small team of product owners that we could rely on.
Yeah, makes total sense. All right, so let's talk a little bit about success. How successful, obviously you delivered the razor. I saw the adverts at the Super Bowl.
Yes.
Which is fantastic to see something that built with Scrum at the Super Bowl. But how successful? Did you deliver? Did it fulfill the objectives that you want?
Absolutely. So here's the product. I know you're a happy user of this. So here's our exfoliating razor. Great success in market. We've launched now, I think, in the US, the UK, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, and last month, China.
Oh, wow.
And more to come. So great success in market. Our consumers that are buying this absolutely love the product, and they're telling us that they love it. So off to a great start. I think there's obviously what we're here for is to make products that delight our consumers that shave. Even more than that, though, Dave, is what I like to see as well is how that's changed the conversation and what we learned from that in how we work projects. We really learned that this working things according to the backlog, working the biggest risks first, raising things early to stakeholders and resolving those risks early has really changed the way that we look at how we're doing the work internally in Gillette. And that's led us now on to say, wow, this was such a great way of working that had such a great outcome. How do we start to scale this approach across our business? We have other products and other project teams. How do we then go and scale this? What are the parts of this that can travel more broadly and we can benefit from in our organization? Well,
hold that thought. So we're actually finished now. We're going to stop. But we are going to do another podcast in person. So I guess it's not a podcast anymore, but an in-person podcast. That we're going to cover those issues. So if you're interested in that, please click on to the part 2 of this really, really interesting interview about razors and Scrum. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.